Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a episode of Unfiltered Conversations. We've done a lot of unfiltered author talks, but it's been a while since we got to our traditional platform here and done an unfiltered conversation. So I'm very happy to be able to do one of these tonight, and I'm even more happy to say that Todd Rhoades has joined us to do our first unfiltered conversations of the year. Todd Rhoades, thank you for joining us, my friend.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I've watched so many of your shows. It's great to be actually in the chair. So
Yeah,
a long time listener, first time caller kind of thing.
I love it. And you come tonight with a very special topic and one that I've heard you talk about quite a bit. And there's obviously a just level of passion there that is
Oh
commendable.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So, without any further ado, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I'm going to make sure this is live on every other platform while you do that. But introduce yourself to the folks that may not know who you are.
Well, great. Yeah. Well, my name's Todd Rhoades. I'm the provost marshal at a site called Battery White. It's located outside of Georgetown, South Carolina, on Winyah Bay, and we're going to get to where all those things are here in just a minute. Some people won't know where that is. I'm also an officer in the Battery White Historical Association, and I kind of look after the site, and I'm the primary contact for essentially the state of South Carolina. If someone's interested in that site, I'd be the one they'd contact, and I'd help them with the history or a tour or anything like that. So just a longtime history nerd. I'm a retired guy that decided to have sort of a second career, and it involves the Civil War. So, hey, how cool is that?
It's awesome, man. And that's probably the best career you could possibly have. The Civil War, obviously, is our favorite topic to talk about here on the Unfiltered Historian. I know we go through a range of different things, but this is where it all
Oh,
starts, and this is where it all goes
absolutely.
back.
I feel privileged to be able to do that, and to
Yeah,
do it at a site that not a lot of people know about. When you say Battery White, it's not like it doesn't have the ring of Vicksburg or something like that. Everybody knows those things, but this
sure.
is a site that I believe is extremely important. It had a fairly profound impact on the outcome of the war, but like nobody talks about it. So
Right.
whenever I present this, it's interesting. I usually get four questions, and one of them is first is where is Winyah Bay? They have no idea where Georgetown is. So let's bring up that
Let's
picture,
do
that
it.
first one. Do you want me to do it first here?
Absolutely. If you want to go ahead and share that screen, we'll get it loaded up for you.
Okay, I'm going to share it up.
And there it is. Alrighty.
So you have a map here. It's just a Google Earth map. And in the lower left corner is Charleston. And in the upper right corner is Myrtle Beach. And you can see Winyah Bay is about right between them. So it is the port of Georgetown, South Carolina. For all practical purposes, that's what we're talking about. So that just places everybody on where we're at. So why is it important? The second question, first question is always, where is it? What's Winyah Bay? And then they'll say, I didn't even know they had a fight there. And I said, well, there wasn't a major fight. There was lots of skirmishes and so forth up and down the coast, but it wasn't a major fight. And then they'll say, well, if there wasn't a major fight there, why are we talking about it? And I say, well, because there's a profound impact of all the activities that happened around Georgetown. So, Tyler, to get things started, I just want to throw out some demographics, and these are going
Absolutely.
to 1860. So, this is based on the 1860 census. So, in 1860, Georgetown, it was All Saints Parish, now Georgetown County, was the second richest county in the country. Don't stop there. In the entire United States, the second richest, behind Adams County, I believe, in Mississippi, would have been the first at that point in time. Five of the top 20 richest people in the United States at that time had holdings, plantations there around Georgetown in that parish.
Okay.
The population at that time was a little over 20,000, and a little over 18,000 of those were enslaved. So 90% enslaved population. Now, the crop there was rice. So at some point in every presentation, somebody will ask me, hey, I thought cotton was king. Well, that's true for the entire South, but for Georgetown, it was rice. And it was about half the nation's rice production came out of this one small area of South Carolina. So you're talking at a time when the total US GDP was about $4.2 billion. this area, this one small area of the country, was generate tens of millions of dollars to those plantation owners who had holdings in that area. So it's a concentration of wealth that's just about unparalleled. I can't think of very many places in this small of an area that could generate that much wealth. Now, one of the real interesting things about the area when I was looking into it is if you look at the entire coast of South Carolina, the Nemars Institute did a study back in 2015 where they used modern LIDAR technology. And they were able to determine that in total, at the peak of the rice production era, 1860, 238,000 acres of South Carolina coastline was used for rice production.
No
At
kidding.
368 square miles. Now, keep in mind, all of that was cleared by hand over a 160-year period between about 1700 and 1860 by enslaved people. So they had taken down forests and swamps and just saltwater marshes. They built miles and miles of dams and dikes and levees and gates and canals and all these things. So that essentially became a gigantic hydraulic machine that was like almost unparalleled in history. So if you consider this, part of the Niemeyer study was they looked at the amount of earth and debris that was moved during that period, and had they stacked that or piled it up, it would have made approximately 40 Great Pyramids. So think about that. Now, the
That's pretty
Great
substantial.
Pyramid in Egypt took 22 years to build. South Carolina was moving enough dirt to build one every 4 years if that dirt had been stacked, up like a pyramid. Of course, it was made into dikes and dams and levees and whatnot, so it doesn't look the same, but it just gives you an idea of the immensity of what this really entailed. It was a gigantic machine, in my opinion, to rival the pyramids. And it's not talked about because it just sort of is grown over today. Today, it's basically back under marshes and swamps, and it's reforested in a lot of areas. But it was a rice generating machine that was a huge economic boon to the Confederacy, and that's why it's important to talk about this.
And that
That's
must be a tribute to the enslaved too, to be
oh
able
yeah.
to forest or deforest even, or to try to clear the land that they're going to use to ultimately produce this rice.
And what's amazing is a lot of the know-how actually came from the slaves. So the population around Georgetown prized slaves from certain parts of Africa that came with rice growing knowledge.
Hmm.
So not only did they do the work, they really had most of the knowledge to make the crop. It wasn't like the people here already knew how to do it. So
Right.
it was really a credit to them. And then I take it one step further, and some people get a little taken aback by this, but it's almost like the plantation owners then were, I'm going to say, modern day pharaohs. These guys had immense tracts of land, thousands of acres was pretty common.
Sure.
They owned people, and they were immensely wealthy and powerful. So that was the system that existed there in 1860. So as things start to change, of course, December of 1860, South Carolina succeeds. Within 30 days of that succession, Governor Pickens, he dispatches a number of adjutants to the area, and they're going to all these plantation owners, and they're asking them to pool their resources because they want to build defenses to guard Winyah Bay. So, of course, at the same time, we know what the Union strategy is. Winfield Scott comes out with the Anaconda Plan, and the Union is going to use their superior Navy to blockade all the southern ports. And as you know, Tyler, they're going to strangle them into submission. I think that's pretty common knowledge. Well, that doesn't surprise anybody, at least not Governor Pickens, who's already planning to go ahead and make defenses for Winyah Bay. So the Anaconda Plan is going. Within 30 days, they start building defenses, and they at first build 3 forts at the mouth of Winyah Bay. So let's go to the next slide there, if you can advance one. or do I advance it?
You advance that. Yeah, that'd be on you there.
Okay.
I've got it full screen for you though, so you're ready to go whenever.
Okay. Let me see if I can advance it. Okay, here
There we
we
go.
go. So they built 3 forts. These forts are 1861 vintage, North Fort, South Fort, and Cat Island Fort, which are actually built on North Island, South Island, and Cat Island. So amazing that they named them after the islands they were built on. So it's easy to remember where they are. Georgetown is mobilizing for war. They start the Georgetown Rifle Guard and the Waccamaw Light Artillery. They're kind of getting things set up. At this stage, Robert E. Lee has not yet been called to Richmond to become Davis's military advisor. This is before he goes to the Army of Northern Virginia. And Beauregard's setting up the defenses in Charleston to the south. So it's kind of a change in command. Lee kind of starts the thing and folds over to Beauregard, and these forts are under construction. So they're manned by local militia that eventually becomes the 10th South Carolina Volunteer Infantry. And Winyah Bay is protected. So the rice trade is still floating. There is some Union blockading activity out in the Atlantic to the east of where you see on this, but plenty of rice is still getting in and out. Now, one of the features of this giant hydraulic machine is that it is really based on floating rice in and out. The production is designed to float. So there's rice barges and so forth that move product in and out, move people in and out. There aren't a lot of roads and there aren't very many railroads in this area. So rice production is really totally dependent on Winyah Bay being open. That's really the only way to get that product practically to market. So the 10th South Carolina, or elements of it, they end up spending a horrible winter in 1861, primarily at the Cat Island Fort. Horrible because they don't have many supplies. Disease breaks out, mumps, measles, typhoid. They end up losing about 30 of their number at the Cat Island Fort. But Winyah Bay is open. They have managed to scrounge cannons from all over South Carolina. So the 3 forts are armed fairly well. And it's not something that the Union is prepared to do anything about. And then something happens in early 1862 after the winter passes, and there's a new commander who comes to town, and his name is John Pemberton. Yes, the same John Pemberton who later goes on to surrender Vicksburg in 1863. He is the commander of this area. And Pemberton, when he takes charge, he sees he's got 3 forts that are basically complete, but he knows he doesn't have anywhere near enough resources to guard the entire South Carolina coast. So they're telling him, you've got just a handful of guys, you got to protect everything. So he decides, he makes the command decision that he is going to focus on Charleston. And he orders the commander of the 10th South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, a guy named Arthur Middleton Manigault, to abandon these 3 forts. So he puts the order out and he tells them, but I want you to do it quietly. So they literally move the cannons out at night. The garrisons leave and they replace the cannons at the garrison, or cannons at each fort, with Quaker guns. So this is one of the first uses of Quaker guns in the entire war, is actually at Winyah Bay. So that fools the Union for a while. Depends on who you ask. The Southern historians I asked say it fooled them for several days and all that. Other ones say it fooled them for a day or two. But eventually the Union comes in and takes possession of those 3 forts. So I'm going to advance the slide here one more time here. So now those 3 forts are in Union hands. The Union, when they come in, the Cat Island Fort is disease-ridden and so forth. They basically just burn it. They don't really occupy it, but they do occupy the North Fort and the South Fort. And then 4 things really happen, Tyler, at that time. The first is they don't just occupy the forts and sit there, but from an Anaconda standpoint, they've just achieved the Anaconda plan. The rice trade is now shut down. So that was they've achieved what they wanted to in early 1862. Second thing they do is they establish a supply port at North Fort so that blockading ships no longer have to go all the way back up to Port Royal or to other ports to get supplies. They can supply or load up with things right there at North Fort, which makes the barricade the whole blockading for you the barricade much more effective, and
Mhm.
that the ships can stay on station much longer, and they can really start to tighten up things up and down the coast because that supply depot is there. And the third thing that happens is they start running raids up and down Winya Bay, and there's four rivers that feed into Winya Bay, and those rivers span out through South Carolina, so they actually are like fingers, and you can get very deep into the state on those four rivers. So they're running raids up and down these rivers, and they're burning rice barges and turpentine barges. They're having skirmishes with the Waccamaw Light Artillery and other militia type units that are trying to defend this massive watershed, and causing all kinds of problems. So these wealthy plantation owners that I spoke of earlier are really concerned. They are angry that the Union now has sway over the entire watershed of Winya Bay and the rivers beyond. So that becomes a big problem. And then the final thing that happens, and maybe one of the most important, is they start to free enslaved people. So the word spreads like wildfire through a community that is 90% enslaved that if you can attach yourself to a Union patrol, or if you can make it to one of the forts at the mouth of Winya Bay, basically you're free. So what starts happening is just an avalanche of escapes. So contrabands begin pouring into these forts, and it just stays that way throughout the war. So many are coming into North Fort that they have to start a contraband camp that sits right next to the fort, and they start regular steamship service to take boatloads of contraband to other ports like Port Royal and so forth, and eventually to freedom. So this becomes the over water super highway to freedom when you think of how many came out. So I think Harriet Tubman, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't she free about 350 people?
Roughly thereabouts, yeah.
Well, thousands escaped here. Thousands.
Mhm.
So many we don't even know. So this was just an incredible amount of people seeking freedom. And these forts being here really did that. So if you're on the backside of that, if you're a plantation owner, one, you can't ship your rice, so you can't sell it, you can't bring in money, and two, your labor force is disappearing. So this is really making them angry. So they get with Governor Pickens and others, and they put immense amount of pressure down on Pemberton. And Pemberton relents, and he comes to Winya Bay personally, and he scouts out two new locations for new fortifications. And he picks the narrowest point in Winya Bay, and he picks a place called Maynard's Bluff. Maynard's Bluff is where Battery White sits today. It was kind of a 20-foot high bluff or so overlooking Winya Bay, and then an opposing battery on Fraser Point. So the whole idea is that once these batteries are in place and manned, a Union ship going up Winya Bay to try to enter the river system that goes into South Carolina would have to run the gambit between these two fortifications. And of course, they're going to be bombarded from both sides as they try to go past. So the same formula applies. He picks these locations, the adjutants go out, the planners all pool their resources, and their enslaved army comes to these two locations, and they start in August of 1862, and by November of 1862 they have built Battery White and Fraser Point. And that sets up an interesting turn of events for the next 3 years. It's basically a standoff. So like other famous places like Gettysburg, in this case the South owns the north end of the bay, and the North owns the south end of the bay, and they are eyeball to eyeball for the next 3 years. So there's an ongoing little skirmishes. The ships will come in and fire a few rounds into the battery. The battery might fire back a few rounds, but there is no major fight. And when people ask me why, again, I got to go back to the Union already achieved the Anaconda Plan. there was really no reason for them to attack Battery White because they had what they wanted. They shut down the rice trade and they closed this port for Southern operations. So their plan from that point on was just to harass them enough so that the South would have to maintain some kind of a garrison at these locations. So it's kind of interesting that that's how it all kind of unfolds. And yes, for 3 years, there's lots of raids and things going on. Just north, if you remember the map, just north of Georgetown, there's a place called Myrtle's Inlet, which today is
Mhm.
kind of a seafood restaurant.
Yeah, I've been to Salty Dog Saloon there a few
Ah,
times.
there you
Yep.
go.
I know where that's at.
The substitute place for blockade runners. So that becomes a hotbed of blockade running. It's a smaller port, so the ships are much smaller, but there's a lot of activity up around Murrells Inlet, which involves some curious things. So Battery White was never manned very heavily. They always suffered. They didn't have enough supplies. They didn't have enough men. The new commander Pemberton, of course, he goes off to Mississippi, and to add insult to injury, he takes the 10th South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, arguably the best group from this whole area. He takes them with him, and they fight at Corinth and end up out west and fight the rest of the war out west and end up they fight all the way until Bennett's the negotiation at Bennett's place. So they really don't come back home. They're gone. So you might say he did them a favor by cherry picking the best of the best and taking them with him. So
Right.
a lot of people believe, and I agree with them, that he knew he was going to Mississippi pretty early on, and he cherry picked. So that's one of the reasons he abandoned Winyah Bay, because he wanted the troops that were there to go with him to Mississippi. They were good. They were a good outfit. So that's just some of the politics, if you want to call it that, that went along with this whole decision. So anyway, it goes on like this. A lot of the blockading activity moves to Murrells Inlet. The Navy begins running raids around Murrells Inlet. They would drop off raiding parties of sailors and Marines, and they would go in and burn some of the blockading or the blockade running ships. So the new commander is a guy named James Trappier, and he is from the Georgetown area. He is a real good friends with Beauregard. In fact, they graduate the same year from West Point. They're roommates. I think, if I remember right, Beauregard graduates second, and James Trappier graduates third in the class from that year from West Point. So he's close. He's got Beauregard pretty close to him, and he gets cavalry units. Some of them grown locally, some of them from 21st Georgia, for instance, is there for a while. And he starts deploying cavalry as a mobile defense force. So it's a little different use of cavalry than what we see in other theaters of the war.
Right.
So he doesn't have near enough troops to formally man the coastline. So these guys ride up and down the coast, and when there's a Union landing or something, it's cavalry that provides the defense. So that sets up a number of different skirmishes and raids that involved Union Navy versus Confederate cavalry. So I ask you, how many times have you heard sailors fighting cavalry?
Can't say that I've heard that too often. No.
No, it doesn't happen. So it's very interesting that would happen, and that was fairly common around Murrells Inlet during this 3-year period where there's this standoff at Winyah Bay. So this goes on all the way until February of 1865, and Battery White's just a story of suffrage. There's discipline problems. Desertion's a big problem. They don't have enough of anything. Trappier spends most of the war just fighting for supplies and things. He does manage to get a couple of 10-inch Columbiad cannons from Tredegar delivered to Battery White in 1864. And those cannons are still there today. So we still have the original 2 cannons that he was able to obtain. And what makes those very special was in 1864, Tredegar, which is in Richmond, is of course involved in the siege between Grant and Lee, right? Petersburg and all that's there. Well, in a normal production year, Tredegar would make dozens and dozens of 10-inch Columbia. They only made 4 in 1864, 4. And 2 of them are at Battery White. I found one at Fort Moultrie. I actually went down and seen it a couple of weeks ago and photographed
Very
it.
cool.
And the last one we think is probably buried in Castle Pinckney in Charleston Harbor. Now, I don't for sure know. We'll have to get it up someday to prove it. But again, that makes these two cannons at Battery White extremely rare.
So that actually begs a question. Do you have any idea what may have been in Battery Weight before the Columbiads made it? Did they just have Napoleon guns? Did they have
Yeah,
anything?
they had 24 pounders, they had 32
Okay.
pounders, a total of 11 pieces of artillery. The biggest being 32-pound Seacoast guns. They had a couple of 12-pounders. I'm going to show you a picture of the battery here in just a minute, and
Okay.
you can see how it's laid out. Matter of fact, let's do that now, and then
Yeah,
we can see
let's do that.
exactly what it looked like. Let me see if I can get this to go forward here. So this is what it looks like, the schematic. If you look at the circle all the way on the left, that was a 12-pound battery that guarded the front defenses. There was like a dry moat in front of the battery.
Mhm.
And then you can count the artillery pieces, so you can see 7 along the parapet. And then there was another side piece to the right. And then there's some rear defenses that I'm going to talk about here in just a little while. So the Battery White is a 3 to 4 acre site, but the actual fort that this was part of was about 100 acres. So the site that they built in 1862 was much larger than what people think. It wasn't just this small battery. This is the powerhouse of the battery, the main defenses, but the entire fort took up a lot more room, and there is a quite extensive set of rear fortifications that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So the little picture there is something I found that is just kind of a artist's rendition of what a fort like this might have looked like back in 1862. So that's kind of gives you an idea of what Battery White would have looked like. There
Okay.
are 2 very large magazines on site. The historic history, I'm going to say, I don't know if that's kind of redundant, but most people thought that these magazines had collapsed. That's what you read in most of the books. And a year or so ago, I had some architects, military architects out, and one of them was a civil engineer. And we got to checking them, and it turns out they were exploded. So at some point after the war, these were detonated, and that was unusual. So we had found enough evidence of a detonation that most people, again, it's not been written anywhere in any of the annals that I've read where these were detonated. But
And do you think that may have been intentional?
I'm sorry.
Was that intentional, or is that
Yeah,
something
I
that?
believe it
Yeah.
was. I believe sometime after the war, the ammunition was probably just unstable enough that they didn't want to mess with it, so they blew them up. So
Yeah.
yeah, don't know
Easy way to
when.
get away with it. Yeah. It's like we
Yeah,
don't have to
and it
deal with
was
this. It's
a heck
gone.
of a boom, but it was surprising. I couldn't find any record of it anywhere. So,
Yeah.
but that's how it looks. So if you look at this, it's very formidable. And
Right.
I'm going to talk about a little more about that here in a little bit when we get to the next slide. So I'm going to advance this one more.
Okay.
All right, so here we are. We're face to face from 1862 to 1865. Start looking at 1865. In January of 1865, Fort Fisher Falls, right? 15th of January. By February, Fort Anderson Falls, Wilmington Falls. Sherman's completed his march to the sea in December. He turns north. Charleston is abandoned. Sherman goes to Columbia, South Carolina. The city is burned down. And you go back to Battery White, and there's about 12 guys left. Everybody else is left. They're either sick, they've deserted, whatever. There's an officer and maybe 11 guys. And these guys are looking around and seeing all this stuff going on around them, and they realize the jig is up. There's nothing that this tiny garrison's going to be able to do to stop the Union from coming in and taking the Battery White. So they abandon and they leave. They spike the guns and they leave. And it's important to note that throughout the war, there were no secrets at Battery White because every enslaved person that escaped was more than happy to deliver intelligence on exactly how many people were there, how many guns they had, all of that. So the Union was always fully informed on exactly what existed at Battery White and knew that there was a tiny garrison there, but there was just, again, no reason for them to really go attack. So February of 1865, the Union finally decides they're going to make a move. They hear that the battery has been abandoned. They send a USS Mingo forward in Winya Bay, and two other ships kind of held back behind it in case. And the Mingo sails up to Battery White, and it fires 4 rounds. We believe those were grape rounds, and no answer. There's no return fire. They pull up, they anchor, they send 50 Marines ashore. The Marines storm the front parapet, and there's nobody home. And now Battery White is a Union fort. So it falls with essentially without a shot being fired, and it's now a Union facility. The ships then go on up to Georgetown. They take the town of Georgetown. They declare martial law, and the Winya Bay and the port of Georgetown are now in Union hands. So it kind of flips over pretty quickly. So about this time, Admiral John Dahlgren, who is now the commander of the blockading fleet on the South Carolina coast, decides he wants to come to Winya Bay and he wants to see what's going on in Georgetown. So he sails to Winya Bay in his flagship called the USS Harvest Moon. I've got a picture of it there, a double steamer. They come into Winya Bay, and he goes up to Georgetown, and he visits there and makes sure that the martial law thing is going or whatever. And then he decides, hey, I want to see Battery White. I've heard so much about this. So he brings the Harvest Moon and he parks it out in front of Battery White, and he goes ashore and he tours the 100 acres that is the entire fort. And ironically enough, he writes the best description of the Confederate fort that we have. So he really writes what's there, and he counts the number of guns. And because of Dahlgren's record of his visit, we now really understand exactly what was sitting at Battery White. When he's all done, he gets back on his ship, and he is called back to Charleston. So he knows that there are torpedoes that have been placed in the bay. We know that Trappier had ordered torpedoes that the harbor be mined or torpedoed as early as 1863. We know that about 22 or so mines were placed in Winya Bay during the corresponding period between 63 and the end of the war. But he's got USS Mingo sweeping for the torpedoes. He wants to make sure the channel's clear, and they do their thing and come back and say, okay, everything is good. Well, the night before Dahlgren's going to leave, 2 Confederates, Captain Stephen Roque, Lieutenant Stephen Roque, and Captain Thomas Daggett, go out into Winya Bay and place a torpedo directly in the channel that they believe the Harvest Moon's going to need to take the following morning to leave the harbor. So sure enough, March 1st, 1865 rolls around. It's about 8 a.m. in the morning. Dahlgren's in his office or in his cabin getting ready to have breakfast. And suddenly there's a giant explosion. Dahlgren is shaken up, kind of thrown around inside his cabin. And sure enough, the Harvest Moon strikes a mine. It blows a 10-foot hole in the side of the ship, and it sinks in about 5 minutes in about 2.5 fathoms of water, which is about 15 feet. So now that's shallow enough that the upper parts of the superstructure are still out of the water, so most of the sailors were able to climb to upper decks. And there's only one fatality, a steward who happened to be in the hold at the time, and his name was John Hazard, and he was the only one who was actually killed in this. His body is recovered the next day and is buried in a small cemetery near Fraser Point. But the ship sinks. It is later salvaged, but today it still rests in Winya Bay, off of Battery White, right where it sank, March 1st, 1865. And as far as I know, Tyler, it's the only Union flagship sunk during the entire war with the admiral on board.
No kidding.
So pretty remarkable, and it's still sitting exactly where it sank all this time. Now, at low tide, the very tip of the smokestack, I've got a picture of it there, sticks out from the water, and you can see it. So it's hard to see today from Battery White because the sand has shifted around a little bit. So
Hmm.
today you probably have to go out on a boat to get a good look at it, but it's still there. And the locals know about it, but not a whole lot of other people. So to me, it's an extraordinary artifact that you don't hear much about. Again, how many flagships do you know of that are still where they sank?
Right, not many at all. Not really none. And that's what I love. I've seen this picture that you shared before here in the bottom corner, and I
Yeah.
just think that's so impressive. And I would love a chance to be able to see something like that because it is so unique. And then these smaller stories tend to resonate even harder because it's something that we can all relate to.
Oh,
Being
absolutely.
such a small story, there's so many stories like Gettysburg and Chancellorsville or Manassas. Like all these stories are huge, but when do you hear about a Union flagship with an admiral on it falling in the water like that? And there's still to this day being visual and visceral evidence of that.
Exactly. Still right there. In the lower left-hand corner of the pictures that I have up is a model that my predecessor, Randy Beaver, made. He was the provost marshal before me. He was an artist and a historian, loved to do models. So he did this model. In the 1960s, they had done a survey. That's the picture in the upper right-hand corner.
Mhm.
It was a plan to maybe raise the Harvest Moon and make it a tourist attraction or whatever, but it lacked funding, and the ship was in pretty bad shape. So ended up that fell through. But based on the survey that they did, Randy made this model. So as of 1960 or so, that's what the Harvest Moon would have looked like on the bottom of Winya Bay. So now it's had 50 more years or 60 more years to sit there. So it's probably deeper into the mud and so forth, but it gives you an idea what it looks like under the water. I just think that's kind of a cool model,
That
so
is
I like to
awesome.
include
I
that.
love it.
Yeah, yeah, me too. I think it's really something else. So now I'm gonna just talk a little bit more about what is there, and I've talked to you about the site is actually 100 acres. So this is a modern lidar of that area of Winya Bay, and you can see on the right side is Winya Bay, and then you can see where I have Battery White outlined. And then if you follow back to the left, the lower right, you'll see the rear defenses. And it's another very extensive earthwork fortification so that now you can see the understanding of why Dahlgren said it was such a formidable place. He compliments its construction and basically says, "Woo! I'm glad we never had to attack here because it would have really been tough."
Mhm.
So if you start at the top here, the north is a lake that lake was dammed in 1700 as a fresh water supply for the rice fields.
Okay.
And you can see in about the center of the picture the real dark canal, like a real straight
Hmm.
line canal. That's a rice canal. And below to the south, you can see it kind of goes downhill, and that would have been all rice fields back in 1860. So essentially, there was gates on either end of that rice canal. And if they needed fresh water for the rice fields, they could open a gate and that lake would drain into the rice fields to the south. Now, if you flip that to military uses, that means to attack this location from the bay, you would have to deal with Battery White. You're going to go point blank into those cannons and so forth. If you land troops and try to attack it from the north, you've got to go across water. Now you've got a lake to deal with. If you land troops and try to attack it directly from the south, you've got rice fields that can be flooded on command. So they could make it pretty tough. And if you see next to the rice canal, there's a little trapezoidal shaped object. That is
Hmm.
actually what we call the causeway battery because there are two causeways that were built across those rice fields. So the only dry land for an attack from the south would have been those causeways. And so the Confederates built two supporting batteries that faced out over those narrow approaches. So had they Union ever attacked from the south, they would have more than likely wanting to get out of the flooded rice fields, climbed onto those causeways, and attacked in single file right into the mouth of a earthwork. It would not have been pretty.
No, not at
So,
all.
so finally, that leaves only the rear, the south, the southwest side, and spanning in those days it would have spanned from water to water. They built some fairly intricate rear defenses. So you can see that they're split. I'm going to show you another view of this, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. But this is a little blurry, but I think you get the picture. This is a double image. It is modern Google Earth. So if you look closely at the base of this photo, you can see modern houses and swimming
Hmm.
pools and buildings and so forth. And then the yellow represents what's left of the earthworks that span over through this neighborhood. So the 1 through 9 are actual residential lots of people who have houses built in and amongst the works. These are original Civil War works that are literally in their backyard. How cool is that?
That's amazing. Can you
It
imagine
is.
having to work like that in your backyard?
Oh man, and the thing is when I got involved, I would say half. Randy Beaver, my predecessor, had put the word out, but people move, property changes hands and so forth. And you can't assume that everybody who buys these lots knows what's in their backyard. So, I've done a lot of work to get to know each person who owns these chunks of land and at least explain to them what is in their backyard, what the significance was. And in one case on Lot 8, I have that a little picture there, the insert. Lot 8, you see that yellow mound or yellow
Hmm.
circle. That was actually another magazine that nobody knew about. It
Oh,
was hidden
wow.
in a guy's house. He had to cut away part of the magazine to get his family room to fit on the lot, to get his house on the lot. And it was just a big mound. He didn't really understand what it was. So when I met with the couple that owns it, great couple, by the way, excellent
Mhm.
couple, um, they had no idea. And then we kind of looked around, and it had a sunken top, so we knew that it was a magazine that had collapsed. The
Mhm.
wooden structure had rotted away, and the mound on top had settled. We ended up having to bring in metal detectors and magnetometers to make sure it wasn't loaded. We were not sure it wasn't full of ammunition. Turned out it wasn't. It's empty. But here we go. We find a magazine that nobody even knew about. And then if you look closely, right in front of that mound, there's a split between the earthworks, and that was the original sally port for the fort, which runs through a neighborhood right now. So the original road didn't come in. You'll see Belle Isle Road near the top. That's the modern road. Well, it didn't come in there back in the day. It came in right through the center of the earthworks. So anyone approaching Battery White Peninsula would have to go between the earthworks, to get in. So you can see that it would be very formidable. And one more thing, if you look at in detail, like on lots 1 and 2 and 3, you'll see little squares along the lines. Now, you'd be tempted to say those are traverses. They're
Right.
actually they're artillery platforms, which is extremely unusual. Now, I mentioned earlier I brought in military architects and a few experts a year ago, and they had never seen these anywhere south of Petersburg, ever.
Mm.
And what it was that they didn't have enough cannon. So if they were attacked from the rear, they would have had to draw cannons off of Battery White or off of the Causeway batteries and roll them up on these platforms so that they would peek out over the top of the berm
So
and
it's
they
an
could.
elevated platform versus just a lunette or something that you would typically see in
Correct.
a
They're
fortification.
platforms. They're flat top with a ramp going up to them, and it's easy. First time I saw them, I thought, oh, traverses, and then when I got to looking, it's not a traverse. These are platforms.
Mm.
So very unusual. For it's an unusual detail that you again don't see in very many places, other than at Battery White, as far as South Carolina is concerned. So interesting that we have that. So the end of the story here is that Battery White falls in February of 1865. March 1st, Dahlgren's ship is sunk off the battery, and then the Union occupies Georgetown. And then in April, the Union brings in occupying forces, and they bring in a number of pretty famous units come and stay in Georgetown and around Battery White. And three of those units are the 32nd, 102nd USCT, and the 54th Massachusetts.
Oh,
So, yeah,
wow.
the one from the Glory was here
Yeah.
on Battery White. They stayed here. Now, in the movie, of course, as you know, they basically get wiped out at Battery Wagner, but in real life, they take horrendous casualties, but about half of them go on to fight more. They fight down at Olustee, then they're brought up to to South Carolina, and the Union decides that they want to conduct a raid across South Carolina to put extra pressure on Johnston and Lee to surrender. So we're getting on towards March and April of 1865. Things are winding down. So you may have heard of Edward Potter, General Edward Potter, and his raid in North Carolina. And they actually take him and they bring him to Georgetown. They give him those three African American units. They give him the 56th New York, the 157th New York, and 25th Ohio, and the 107th Ohio, about 2,700 Union soldiers. And they embark on a raid across South Carolina that begins on April 5th. They move out. They move through Manning, through Sumter. They get all the way out to Camden, South Carolina, and they are burning railways, burning cotton supplies, basically just really putting the pressure on South Carolina. They're opposed by primarily old men and boys and militia units and some convalescents. By this time, South Carolina has been played out. So a lot of historians say it was a punitive raid. Others say it was to put the end pressure on Johnston and on Lee to do something, as far as surrendering. So the raid goes from the 5th of April all the way to the 21st. So the raid is on when Lee surrenders on the 9th at Appomattox, but the raid continues. They're still burning rail cars and burning cotton supplies. And it is really devastating to South Carolina that this raid is conducted. And they return to Battery White and to Georgetown on the 21st. And in tow, behind this 2,700 Union troops, is 5,000 contraband. So when I went back earlier to say how many contraband, how many people were freed by Harriet Tubman, not to diminish her in any way, it was at least 5,000 in this one raid. And it went on and on and on for the whole war. They were escaping here. So it's in the thousands of people escaped slavery through this very area, which is pretty cool. And the final irony of this is that Battery White, which was built in 1862 primarily built by enslaved labor, by 1865 is occupied by 3 Union regiments, African American regiments that are primarily comprised of former enslaved people. Talk about coming full circle in the war.
No kidding.
Isn't that something? And it has the 54th on top of it all.
Right, like they're one of the most prestigious and most famous of the colored troops at the time. So that's really insane to have.
Exactly. So and one last little piece of trivia, you may not have ever heard this. So the last Union officer killed in the entire war was a guy named Lieutenant E.L. Stevens of the 54th Massachusetts, and it was during a fight at Boykins Mills, South Carolina. One of the last fights. It was a 15-year-old kid named Burwell Boykin. He was defending his home, and he shot this Union officer and killed him. And that was the last Union officer of the entire war to died on Potter's raid to South Carolina. So, another piece of trivia, but a pretty significant piece. Everybody knows Elmer Ellsworth, right? Everybody knows that story. But who was the last guy?
That's right.
It was E.L. Stevens of the 54th Massachusetts. So I didn't know that until I did the research on this site.
And see what it brings. A small site like this can bring something so substantial like that. A small site like this that has, what most people would think doesn't have an impact, but you've proven tonight that this does have a very significant impact to the war effort.
It was tens of millions of dollars to the Confederate coffers. It cut off the rice trade. It closed a significant port, and it served as a launching pad to really rip the guts out of the logistics system of South Carolina towards the end of the war. So it was, I believe, a very significant place in the war that just isn't talked about.
Not
So
at
that's
all.
why I really appreciate being on the show tonight. And this the picture that I have up here is part of this is my personal preservation work. So I always wanted to get involved with preservation. So I'm a member of the South Carolina Battlefield um, uh, Preservation Trust. I work with them. They're the ones who made me a provost marshal, and I'm working with them to work with these 9 property owners to sign protective easements so that no one ever builds a garage or a swimming pool and takes out the Civil War mound. And so I'm working with it. I've been on it for about 2 years now, and we're making progress. And I'm hoping that someday I can say, "Hey, I saved 600 yards of original Civil War earthwork. I was there to help save that, and that to me would be a great personal accomplishment.
Heck yeah, it would. That's
By
awesome.
the best history-related accomplishment I've ever done.
Oh, 100%. That is just absolutely incredible. And you mentioned earlier too that Battery White is a place that is public. There are some places you cannot go because this place does have a lot of private properties. But is there somewhere that if folks ever want to see Battery White or be
Yeah.
able to see part of this, is there something they can do to go see that?
Yeah, Battery White is on the National Register, so it is open to the public. It is in a gated community. Today, there's condominiums that cover this entire 100-acre site and housing developments and so forth. But the site itself, that 4 or 5 acres that I showed earlier, is protected and on the register. So
Awesome.
if someone wanted to visit Battery White, when you get there, you'll pull up to a gate. It's a gated community, and there's a phone number there. You call that phone number and say you're there to see the battery, and they'll open the gate and let you in. They typically do it from 10 to 4 weekdays is the hours, and it's a residential community, and they can control the amount of traffic that goes through there. It's part of their easement. When the condominium community was developed, Tyler, they had come to terms. If they listed the property and got it on the register, they knew they had to have it open to the public. But because it's a residential neighborhood, they wanted to control the hours, and that's what they came up with. So if you're there 10 to 4, that's great. I would also encourage anyone to join our Facebook page. That's the Battery White Historical Association. If you do a Facebook search on that, it'll take you out there. I'm one of the administrators, and I give tours. So if I know someone's coming, I'll time my visits down there, and I do that from time to time. Not a lot, but here and there I give some tours, and it gives them an opportunity to really to understand exactly what's going on. You also have we have a 15-stop tour that's set up around the battery. So if you go there, if you go out to batterywhite.org, there's the key, and it'll be numbered 1 through 15. So you go there, you stand in front of the post numbered 1, and you pull up the internet and pull up that, and it'll tell you what you're looking at. Eventually, that's going to be QR codes and live video, but I haven't quite got there yet.
It's
So
a work
that's
in progress, is it not?
a work in progress.
That's
There's
right.
always something more you can do.
That's it. And so in the chats there for every platform you folks are watching on today, I have not only dropped the Facebook group. So if you're on Facebook, that link right there that is in the chat will take you straight to the Battery White Facebook page. And actually, let me get the right one in there. I think I've just posted it twice. Let me just make sure we have it. Batterywhite.org is also in the chat. So if you wanted to visit that site, that is also in the chat there. But Todd, do you have any last minute thoughts before we close out here tonight?
No, again, thank you for letting me be here. I appreciate it. I feel like I'm sitting in a chair where a lot of famous people before me have sat. So it's like, standing in the batter's box at Wrigley Field or something,
Well, you have
Some
brought
famous people have been right there.
and you've brought some attention tonight to something that is very important to you, obviously, very important to the war too. So again, folks, Todd is a very instrumental piece in helping to keep something as important as Battery White preserved, and is an active progress in preserving this place. So if you find yourself down in Winyah Bay or find yourself near Georgetown, South Carolina, make sure that you find Todd and you go out and you spend some time with Battery White, because this is one of those places that not many of us get to see. We get to see all the major national parks and all these huge preserved areas, but there's always these smaller ones that don't get the attention. So it deserves the attention. And Todd, I appreciate you so much for taking the time today to come on and share something like this with us. Because to me, the smaller sites are the really, really, really cool ones to go visit. And some of the most powerful impacts I've ever had on a battlefield are at ones that aren't necessarily in the biggest state of preservation or on the biggest scale of to be visited sites, if you will. So I
Awesome.
want to
Well,
thank you
thank you.
again
I
for that.
appreciate being here.
Absolutely. And folks, again, thank you guys for watching. And